Thanks very much. And thanks for listening to me. It's a shame I'm not in Adelaide, but it's a relief for me in some ways because I feel like a complete fraud in that I'm a hydrometallurgist at a high temperature process forum. We as hydros get excited at about 200 degrees. I'm sure Gus doesn't get out of bed for anything less than 800. That being said, don't switch off. There are high temperature aspects to lithium processing, and I'll be talking to them towards the end of the speech. So just in terms of overview, I want to talk about the carbon imperative that necessitates the growth in lithium, the lithium industry and the flow sheets, and then what we can do within the lithium industry to further decarbonize our world. Just to regain some credibility, I just want to give you a brief overview of our lithium experience. We've been playing with lithium for over 2 decades now, well before it was in vogue, and even now. So we all across the spectrum, including building the first continuous hard rock processing plant that was done in China. So the carbon imperative. So why lithium? Why is this important? Why are you listening to me? So lithium's a key enabler of reducing greenhouse gases. So its position in the periodic table in the top left-hand corner there makes it the ideal choice for use in transportation. It's light and it carries a charge that enables batteries to be used in transportation sectors. And what this does is that builds economies of scale and infrastructure such that it can then be used in other applications, specifically to enable renewable energy to be stored and used when it's required most. As the people in Adelaide and South Australia are certainly well aware. So looking specifically at transportation then and focusing on that, because that's the real key to the growth in lithium. Looking at Australia's greenhouse gas emissions, you see it's about 15 to 18% is associated with transportation. And you find the emissions are relatively consistent across different countries. So here's United States, for example, in 2017, transportation accounted for about 29% of their overall greenhouse gas emissions. And predominantly within the transportation sector, the majority of them were associated with the light duty vehicles. So those that we're most able to replace with battery instead of the internal combustion engines. Looking wider in terms of the global transportation emissions, you see the graph on the right there shows the increase in greenhouse gas emissions attributed to transportation. You see again, it's the same story. Within that transportation, the emissions are growing, and predominantly due to road and vehicle transportation. So, and even within the transportation section, the proportion associated with vehicles is increasing. So if we want to be serious about tackling greenhouse gas emissions and reducing our profile, global transportation is a very large sector for us to look at. And to add some pessimism, the improvements have stalled. So we've seen pretty dramatic increases, or rather decreases, in our average CO2 emissions, and that's come as a result predominantly through increasing efficiencies of internal combustion engines, with some replacement on greenhouse gas emissions. But you see towards about 5-6 years ago, the trend downwards has stopped, and we're no longer able to achieve these targets without looking at moving towards a more electrified transportation section. So a step change is required if we're going to further reduce greenhouse gas profile. So looking at the advantage of electric vehicles, they have lower emissions. So EVs are the obvious solution. So you compare it to the average new European car, and this is a life cycle analysis over 150,000 kilometers. And you see that the European car, an electric car based on an average European electricity carbon intensity has about half the total greenhouse gas emissions compared to an average new European car. And even the most fuel efficient ICE vehicle, it's still lower than. So, and this has been replicated. But some critics will point to saying that that's because it's a European power consumption. But this has been replicated, even adjusting for Australia's coal propensity. You still see the same flavour. So across various studies, the percentages may change, but the theme of the graph remains the same, that electric cars inherently produce fewer greenhouse gas emissions. Notice here that the yellow section of the graph is the lithium battery, and that's key. So that's a pretty reasonable difference between internal combustion engine and an electric vehicle. And so I just wanted to explore that, particularly early on when you're looking at purely the manufacturing to get it. So let's look into what's causing that increase in greenhouse gas emissions during the battery manufacturing. I've got two graphs here. I've got a graph looking at greenhouse gas emissions of the battery pack. So that's this column here on the right-hand side. And that's looking at the battery pack manufacturing as a whole. And you'll see that a reasonable amount of that, almost 40%, is associated with what's called the cathode. So in this particular example, it's NMC 111. And this second graph here is expanding that section of the graph further and looking at its constituents. So you see a couple of things. I've highlighted the different aspects associated with the lithium. So there's a tiny contribution here associated with the lithium phosphate fluoride, which is the electrolyte within a battery pack. And then there's the lithium carbonate contribution to the overall cathode. So the real key point here in this section is none of this happens without lithium. Lithium's a key enabler, but it's not a significant contribution to the overall greenhouse gas intensity of battery manufacturing. So what I want to do is just look within the lithium industry and just give people a bit of background around the industry. So fundamentally, there are two main sources. You've got the brine and the hard rock, which is predominantly spodumene. So these account for over 90% of your lithium. Your brines are evaporated lakes, typically in South America, Atacama, for example. And your hard rock is typically spodumene that's found Western Australia, Canada, and to a lesser extent in China and Brazil. And the two key products, both lithium carbonate, lithium hydroxide, both a fine white powder from South America. Just looking at that geographically, you see Australia contributes a significant amount associated with the hard rock mining. A couple of blue circles indicate that we're starting to produce and convert that hard rock within Perth. And there are a couple of plants under construction there at the moment. Some large circles out of Chile, Argentina, and the battery manufacturing predominantly taking place in the battery triangle of China, Japan, South Korea. I want to bring this slide to your attention just to give you an idea of the recency of the lithium industry. So looking at 2000, rechargeable batteries were a very small component, and the industry was dominated by a huge range of different users, predominantly ceramics, and ceramics were only displaced by rechargeable batteries in about 2015. So the battery growth and that story there within the lithium industry has been recent. So what this has done is this has put a focus on meeting demand, but also the purity requirements of the lithium carbonate or lithium products is really driving that, because as you can appreciate, you need a lot more purity.
I'm in. Thank you. I don't need to join the live, right?
I'll continue. Looking back towards the history, you see predominantly the rechargeable battery has been driven by portable consumer electronics, and in the last couple of years, this growth has really been kickstarted through the automotive. One thing I want to draw your attention to is the scale on this axis. So this is historic growth, and we've topped out at about 120 gigawatt hours. Looking forward, you see that grows about tenfold, and predominantly through the automotive. And this projection doesn't give a huge amount of weight to energy storage, stationary storage systems. So it's predominantly saying that the growths are occurring through the automotive industry. So again, that reiterates the industry focus is really on growth, meeting demand, and that product purity. So just summarizing from an industry perspective, the focus has morphed where it's a recent industry, predominantly driven initially through consumer electronics, now into EVs, and it's brought a lot of entrants in. The juniors are associated with staying in business. Seniors really are there to ensure they meet demand and meet it at the required purity. And to a lesser extent, they're now starting to focus on sustainability. Starting to get more technical, looking at the lithium flow sheets here, I just wanted to provide some context initially. So the plants are relatively small. So a typical train or a typical module of a plant is about 20,000 tonne per annum lithium carbonate or equivalent. And that carbon intensity is reasonably low. So for a concentrator to produce amount that much, it's about 25,000 tonne per annum lithium or carbon emissions. A refinery of that hard rock is 100 to 130 kilotons of CO2 at that 20,000 tonne per annum plant. Whereas you look at the brine, and that's a much lower carbon intensity there. So just to put that in the context of Australia's greenhouse gas, if we had a 20,000 tonne per annum lithium carbonate mine and concentrator and refinery, that contribute 0.02% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. So let's look at what that flow sheet actually looks like. So for the hard rock processes, we mine it, produce a concentrate. We heat that concentrate up to 1100 degrees, mix it with sulfuric acid and bake it at 250 degrees. And then it's the more boring hydrometallurgical aspect where we leach it, remove the impurities, and produce our lithium carbonate crystals, or lithium hydroxide in this case. Highlighting the high temperature aspects, the calciner runs 1050 to 1100 degrees Celsius. The acid roast is about 250 degrees. So high temperature it's really that front end aspect. The rival brine flow sheet is a bit more simpler. We pump it up from within these evaporated lakes. We evaporate it further in square kilometres of ponds where the sun does all the heavy lifting. We concentrate it to a point where it becomes economically viable to process it, and then it's a bit of a simpler route to remove the impurities and precipitate our lithium carbonate. So I'm aware I'm speaking at a high temperature conference. I was struggling to make the brine flow sheet relevant, and then I thought about the key unit operation, and the only reason this pathway is economic is because it had a unit operation operating at above 5,000 degrees Celsius. But then I realised that predominantly that unit operation was already hydrogen fueled, and so not that relevant to a forum specifically talking about greenhouse gas emissions. So I'll just continue on and look at carbon reduction within the lithium industry. So predominantly, I didn't mention it earlier, but in the carbon intensities, the different flow sheets, 2/3 in the hard rock refinery processing, 2/3 of those scope 1 and scope 2 emissions were associated with the electricity consumption. So one third was really the natural gas to fire your calciners and your acid kilns. 2/3 is associated with the electricity predominantly driven by your hydrometallurgical processing. However, decarbonisation in the lithium flow sheets really focus on the kilns to look at those scope 1 emissions, what we can do to reduce carbon intensity in that processing. Fundamentally, if you're looking to make a step change reduction, there are efficiencies within the hydrometallurgical process we can do, and then a couple of blue sky potentials towards the end. So none of this on the calciner. This is a calciner with preheating and great cooling and a use of a waste heat. So this isn't going to look revolutionary at all to anyone familiar with the cement industry, but this is only starting to gain traction within the lithium industry. As I mentioned, the plants are small. And it's only now we're starting to see improvements in the industry, such as the use of preheaters, the use of grate coolers, and waste heat. So there's still scope for reduction there in terms of some of the greenhouse gas potential.
Sorry, Nick, 1 minute, please. Yeah.
Sure. All right. I'll speed on then. Here's a picture. The maximising efficiency within the process, we can look at MVRs using electricity as opposed to TVRs using steam, and also minimising water ingress. I suppose one of the key aspects I wanted to draw attention to is a bit beyond the scope of a lithium flow sheet, but to really highlight the fact that the cathode manufacturing itself accounts for about 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions, the calciner and co-precipitation of that battery material. There are issues with trying to change this process. Fundamentally, it's a very conservative industry, but also the operating cost drivers are not there. So the raw material cost is 50% of the cost of your cathode manufacturing. The energy cost is very small. Looking at the cathode manufacturing process, there is some fruit there for us to improve, particularly this final step here, which is the sintering kiln operating at elevated temperatures, and that to me, and Gus hasn't paid for the sponsorship, but it is a high purity solar calcination. I mean, that just reeks of potential there. But even within this process, there's opportunity for energy recycling and carbon dioxide capture. So finally, lithium's an enabler. It's not a key contributor, but for us to implement any of these changes, you need lithium. So we're progressing. We're a recent and immature industry, but we're looking down that pathway to reduce our greenhouse gas within the industry.